without any further ado, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome R.J. Jenkins, who is a member of the Columbia University Center for Veteran Transition and Integration. He's a curriculum design specialist there, as well as assists with instructions, where it's an area in a center that's absolutely focused on this question of transition. RJ, again, thank you very, very much for joining us today. And RJ will also be joined by three great Tillman scholars again. We have Chris Diaz, Mott, and LaChiana Hamilton will also be joining us out here on the stage. All of y'all, welcome. Thank you all very, very much. And I'll turn it over to y'all.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you to JD. Thank you for the foundation. It's a breathtaking pleasure to be in the company of folks like you. It's funny talking about impostor phenomenon when you're currently experiencing it. I had a moment before I got on stage where I thought of faking the flu, but here I am. And I just want to say also that I am a civilian, but have dedicated my career to serving those who have served. So thank you all very much for your service. What we're going to do is I'm going to spend about 11 minutes talking about this thing called impostor phenomenon. I'm going to put a little challenge on the table, and then I'm going to pass it to our panel who have some things they'd like to share with you about this particular thing. What is impostor phenomenon? And I saw some questions come in the last section. I think someone said, how can you stay motivated when you feel like you get deflated? How do the three of you stay humble? And the last question, which I suspect JD may have planted, have you ever experienced imposter syndrome? So for whoever set me up, thank you. I do want you to think a little bit about your personal and professional life, though, really quickly, as you hear this definition. A pervasive feeling of self-doubt, insecurity, and/or incompetence, despite evidence that you are skilled, talented, successful, and deserving. Has anyone in the room ever in their personal or professional life, by a show of hands, experienced something like this? Amen. We're going to talk more about why populations like this experience this even more vividly than some others, but it's a fascinating thing, and I'm glad that everyone was able to sort of respond to that question. What does it actually look like? Again, I'd like you to think about your personal and professional life. Here are some of the major hallmarks of this thing. Consistent, sometimes debilitating self-undervaluation, feelings of being out of place, not belonging, or undeserving, persistent, often internalized fear of being a fraud. I want to focus on internalized here because very rarely do we say these things out loud. I love this. You're like, mm-hmm. Keep doing that for me. We don't talk about these things, right? We hide them because we're afraid if we say them out loud, I think that it makes them more true. Willingness to ignore or refuse the value of our contributions and accomplishments while also lifting everyone around us up. And finally, a tendency to attribute success to external factors, your team, your luck, your timing, as opposed to internal factors such as intelligence, talent, or work ethic. So again, of these 5 things, let's go back. Undervaluation, sense of not necessarily belonging or not deserving where you are, being where you are, persistent fear of being a fraud, willingness to ignore the value of your own contributions, or sometimes attributing your success to external rather than internal factors. How many folks have experienced at least one of these things, let's say, in the last 10 minutes? I had a student at Columbia who once said to me, I forced him to write it down, when I sit in class, every time the door opens, I a little bit fear that it will be someone from admissions coming to revoke my acceptance. Quiet, nagging feeling I have that my being here has to be a mistake or an oversight or a glitch. Like I must have slipped through the cracks somehow, and it's only a matter of time before someone figures it out. To me, this is so profound in its simplicity, right? That I must have slipped through the cracks. And my favorite part of it is, I a little bit fear. For him, it's not a debilitating fear. It's not a suffocating fear. It's a quiet, nagging sensation that never really goes away, especially in comparison with the people around us. I think they must have messed up. But my favorite articulation around this topic is this one. What gives me the right to be here? What gives me the right to be here? We talk about this thing in a couple of different ways, and I'm not a clinical psychologist. I'm a higher academic administrator. I work with hundreds of veterans who are transitioning from active military service to the rigors of the college classroom. So I know this from a vocational perspective. There are two primary ways that we talk about this thing. One is as a psychological phenomenon. You've probably heard of something called imposter syndrome. I don't like the word syndrome. It's a little pathological for me. Especially since imposter syndrome is not recognized as a clinical disorder in the DSM. But we do talk about it this way, as something to be managed, treated, mitigated, or otherwise overcome. You'll see it sometimes annihilate your imposter syndrome. But also as a character flaw, a weakness, right, a professional liability. If you do a quick Google search of this topic, these are the three best seller articles and books. 5 types of imposter syndrome and how to beat them, how to overcome imposter syndrome, 21 proven ways, and my personal favorite, 3 tactics to defeat imposter syndrome. So we go from a kind of professional wrestling analogy of beating your imposter syndrome to a militarized one of actually using tactics to defeat an enemy that we're all facing. What I find really worrying about this kind of language, and we talk about this a little more in the panel, is the ways in which this kind of language locates imposter phenomenon in the individual and refuses to acknowledge the facts of our environment that also sometimes make us feel this way. Right? This is a thing that lives in here, and you have to manage it in here. And I think it takes a little bit of responsibility away from some of our organizations and institutional cultures, right, that help create an environment like this. And there are good reasons for talking about it this way. I'm going to talk about it a little bit differently, but there are good reasons to talk about it this way. Studies suggest that about 70% of people experience imposter feelings. I think that's a lowball number. I think it's more like 80 to 90%. In fact, if I ever encountered a person who always felt fully entitled to be in the room that they're in, I would worry about them. To me, that's actually the red flag. Oh, you think you're 100% deserving of everything you've ever had? Bye.
It's called a narcissist. Mm-hmm.
But also, there's some really robust research out there that suggests that this is more than just something you feel, right? That there are meaningful impacts on people's performance in school and at work. Academic achievement, pay gaps, missed promotions around people who are debilitated by these feelings. We also know that imposter phenomenon is correlated to other mental health issues. So even though this thing that we're talking about doesn't live in the DSM, we often see it show up next to things like high stress or depression. And finally, and we can talk a little bit more about this in the panel as well, imposter phenomenon exists a little bit more prevalently in minority populations. Because when people perceive that they are different from the majority, it can fuel these kinds of feelings. My question for the room today, and I'm hoping that our major action item for today is there a way to rehabilitate this yucky thing? This thing that we've all sort of decided is gross, something that needs to be battled or overcome, right? Something that we don't want to associate ourselves with. And I think that there is a way to do that. What we have discovered, not only with imposter phenomenon, but also the recent research on stress, which is fascinating, is that the negative effects of imposter phenomenon have less to do with imposter feelings themselves, which it turns out are perfectly natural to have, a perfectly natural and actually evolutionarily based response to a new environment, okay? And more to do with the fact that we have decided that imposter feelings are inherently bad and detrimental. And because we have decided that, when we feel them, we flip out, and it affects our performance. So what that means, if this is true, and again, you can look at research on stress too that suggests the same thing. The reason stress is so harmful to our body is because we have decided that the stress response which is actually supposed to be a performance-enhancing response, we've decided that stress is yucky, and it becomes yucky for our body. So if this is true, if our perception of imposter feelings are actually the thing at play, then what it means is if we can reimagine what these things are, then we can reimagine our response to them, and we may be able to mitigate not the imposter feelings themselves, but the negative and deleterious impacts they have on our personal and professional life. So let's look back a little bit at this list of hallmarks of imposter phenomenon, and you see them here. Undervaluation, feelings of being out of place, a worry that you're going to be found out, that someone's going to walk in the room and drag you out by your shirt collar because you were a mistake. Willingness to refuse the value of your contributions, and a tendency to attribute your success to external rather than internal factors. What if I told you that the flip side of all of these things and other key qualities that we find overwhelmingly in people who exhibit imposter feelings are these: consistently high achieving, perfectionist, people who maintain extremely high standards for themselves, enthusiastic to celebrate the value and achievements of others, and willing to put the virtue of the team over virtue of self, alert and adept readers of the environment, and people who are hungry for feedback and are willing to showcase their mistakes in the interest of growth and development. Ladies and gentlemen, you're looking at yourselves, right? Anybody who saw this list of qualities in a human being would be hungry to have that person on their team. And these are qualities we consistently see in people who exhibit imposter feelings. And the final one is this one. This is the word that comes up most often as strongly correlated with people who experience imposter feelings: humble, humility. How is this defined? In a Catalyst study of 2014, really fascinating study, and has been sort of the hallmark of this research for a long time, 1,500 leaders and their teams surveyed. What humble meant to them was the following: self-aware, willing to be self-critical, open to feedback, constantly creating a culture of constructive feedback, empathetic and open-minded, meaning willing to have their minds changed by someone on their team. But critically, they defined it this way: a leader was described as humble when she expressed a lower opinion of her own leadership than her team did. You had a leader, and you're like, on a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being bad, 10 being good, how good of a leader you are? I'm about a 6. And the team's like, homegirl's a 9. A person who's willing to describe their leadership in less sort of glowing terms than their team was described for the purposes of this study as humble. And when they did meet this mark, this is what you found in these teams: increased commitment and buy-in to ideas, increased productivity, a culture of the giving and receiving of constructive feedback, and higher overall satisfaction. So in one world, an imposter phenomenon world, rating your own performance lower than your team would be what? Self-deprecating, a lack of confidence, feeling like you don't belong. And according to this study, it's something called humility. And in the article that really represents this study, the headline is "The Best Leaders Are Humble Leaders." So the question for us, I think, and the question for the panel is, what kind of leaders are we inspired to be, and are we aspiring to be? And the other question I want to ask of the room is, are you suffering from imposter syndrome, or are you modeling transformational humility? Are you suffering from imposter feelings, or are you showing people how to lead in a humble and aspiring way? And I think that that's the kind of question. It's not a question that's getting asked all the time. Again, people aren't really taking the time to unearth this concept. And so what we're going to do right now is we're going to turn to 3 people who JD has identified as people who are doing this in their daily professional and personal lives, and hear a little bit more about how this thing called imposter phenomenon hasn't necessarily debilitated these folks, but has become part and parcel of their methodology of doing their work. And just just for a second, this is the kind of thing you see, and I hope that in the future when you see it, you push gently back against it, right? Common among people in high-profile authority positions, and of course in actual phonies like you, right? Which I think is useful. So I'm going to go ahead now, and I'm going to invite the panel to introduce themselves, and then each of you is going to start with just a little bit of a place to start the conversation in terms of this particular topic. Thank you so much.
Okay, should I start?
Please.
Hello, my name is LaChiana Hamilton. I am a doctor of nursing practice. I currently work in pediatrics in a federally qualified health center. I serve the socioeconomically disadvantaged and underprivileged. I love taking care of poor kids. So the first time after departing from military service that I experienced this imposter syndrome was in my clinical rotations. I went back to school to get a second bachelor's after I already had a master's in nursing. And I decided after attending nursing school that, as my husband told me before I started, girl, you ain't no nurse. I'm like, no, I am not. I'm used to telling people what to do. So I had a very hard time taking commands. And so I applied to go back to school to get a doctorate after never practicing as a nurse. And because of my scholarship with the Tillman Foundation, I had gotten into the master's program. I could not go full-time. You had to be a full-time student, so the university placed me in the doctoral program with no application, no interview, and no letters of recommendation. So I was quite the imposter. So when I started my clinical rotations, my very first rotation, I was terrified. And my preceptor constantly introduced me as her doctoral student who had never practiced as a nurse. So you can imagine how the room reacted to me because they thought I, number one, didn't deserve to be there, and they couldn't believe I never practiced as a nurse. And finally, after she had done this to me 3 times, I pulled her aside and I said, I am enough. I belong here. I will do what I need to do. And you don't know me personally, so don't introduce me like that ever again. Because I told her I'm where I belong. I am enough. So, I mean, I had to dig back into the little girl inside of me, who, as you mentioned in your talk, as many of you can see, I am a minority. So I didn't realize that the world was prejudiced until I was 13. I grew up in Germany and Korea. My father was in the military. He was the first African American to graduate from North Georgia Military College and get a commission. So we never lived around a bunch of African American people, if you could imagine what that is like. At 13, I moved to Alabama, where I learned that I was different in more ways than one. And so my father had to constantly remind me, you are enough. Mm-hmm. And so this phenomenon is very real to me, but at the same time, I will never forget, I belong. I'm where I'm supposed to be.
Good morning. I'm Chris Diaz, a 2013 scholar. I currently provide psychological services for the Milwaukee Brewers, helping athletes and coaches with performance psychology. I spoke a couple years ago for the foundation on the imposter syndrome because I became familiar with it making my transition from the world's finest Navy to academia. Started off as a 30-year-old junior undergrad, trying to pursue this path in 2012 to become a psychologist. I'll remember vividly, for those of you who know the Philadelphia area, Drexel shares campuses pretty much with University of Pennsylvania, Ivy League school, and there's a row of restaurants that divide both universities. And the colleagues of mine in my psychology lab decided to go out, all the graduate students to go out for a meal. And so it's at this swanky Ivy League White Dog Cafe, and it's me and then 7 other white, mid-20-year-old Ivy League educated women. And I am none of those things. I had still had my combat beard. I'm a first-generation American, English as a second language. And while they were talking about the studies and their wedding plans, I was thinking of choking someone or shooting something. That's where my mind goes often. And so just constantly asking myself, like, what am I doing here? And so in considering how often I was having those thoughts of what am I doing here with 18-year-old kids taking undergrad courses, with no life experience, having served as the best job you can possibly have in the military. I was an FMF corpsman with the Marines. There was just a huge disconnect. And so it did make me drive harder. And so as RJ was mentioning, why it is that we have these feelings, it does come from an evolutionary place. We, as humans, want to connect with those around us. We want to belong. And so that voice that we're listening to is us trying to reconcile, do I belong? And what, as you stated, like, I am enough, I do belong. It's not enough, and psychology has kind of fallen to this in its history. It's not enough to reframe recognizing this thought of I don't know if I belong, to just tell yourself, well, I do belong, right? Like, that doesn't work. The reframing of that as being a distortion is traditionally how psychologists have tried to counteract the effects or impacts of the impostor phenomenon or any type of psychological maladaptive thinking process. Instead, the self-awareness component, I think, is what's crucially important to recognize. Becoming aware of that thought that you're having, recognizing it, noticing it, and then letting it be. Letting go and dropping the struggle of trying to convince yourself well, this is the list of things that I have done to try to counteract and prove to yourself that you belong, right? That takes far more energy. And I'm not saying that this acceptance component is an easy thing. I still deal with it. However, it is a way in which getting over the imposter syndrome is not ever rehabilitating it as much, RJ, but accepting those as being a natural process.
I was just going to sit here and listen. I kind of was enjoying it. I'm Chrissy Mott. I am a 2017 scholar working on a PhD in forestry at Northern Arizona. So there's like 5 of us out of the 600 scholars that are natural sciences. So like, okay, I don't fit, whatever. But, I've had conversations with everybody up here kind of as we're leading up to this. And it occurred to me, as I'm thinking about where does this come from and why is this such a big deal for us? And I think for me, a lot of that goes back to actually my military service. And, I went to the Air Force Academy. It was always team, 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 team. I was an aircraft maintenance officer. It was always team, 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 team. Also, I was a female aircraft maintenance officer. So when you say you are expected, always giving the value to the team, never taking credit for yourself, that was essentially beat into me when I was a lieutenant. So for me, I think my entire military career was just, you don't take credit for anything. It was expected of me as a very visible sort of person that I would not draw attention to myself. I would not take that credit. And that's something that I think I carried through because for all the new scholars, my first PTLS, I was terrified. I was like, oh my God, what am I even doing here? Like, LaChiana was actually literally the first person I met walking in the door, so that was kind of fun. She's very friendly, right? I was like, okay, But I walked in here and I was like, I don't belong here. Like, what am I? But, over the last 2 years, fortunately, I'm a triathlete too, so comfort in discomfort is kind of something that I've gotten used to. I know I don't fit anywhere I go. And, JD was talking earlier about looking at our potential, not at what we've done or what we do, but looking at our potential. And for me, that discomfort, that never fitting in, I'm 37 years old. My lab mates are 25. My professors are 40. But not fitting in actually allows me a lot more movement. I can move around my department and talk to anyone I want to because I don't fit. I'm not stovepiped. I don't fit anywhere. So it's actually kind of not being comfortable where I'm at actually helps me move around and I think learn more and get more out of my program.
Before we open up to questions, I just wanted to highlight one of the questions that was asked in the last round, because you've now heard from 6 of these folks, all of whom are unbelievably impressive, accomplished in their various fields. And at the very end of the last session, someone said, how do you personally manage this in your life? Do you experience this thing? Is it just me that is experiencing it? And how do you manage it in your own life? I'm wondering if the panelists would say a word about, in your own personal and professional worlds, do you have a tactic to sort of either reframe this? Do you accept it as natural and move forward, or has it become a kind of strength for you?
I could open up that conversation. I think that as a professional, because of this imposter phenomena, it pushes me to study, read, and try harder. And so if I go and see a patient and I have no idea what they have, I don't mind going and asking someone else, what do you think this is? Or I don't mind pulling out a textbook and searching. I find that in the profession that I have entered into, many people think they know everything. And so when you know so much, you also don't know how to admit that you are wrong or that you don't know things. And that's how people lose their lives. One of the greatest compliments I get on a daily basis is that I actually listen. And I think that as a minority, because I have been marginalized my entire life, it is very easy to me to sit from a point of a disadvantage and try to find advantage in others. I often also remind myself that if you don't know me personally, you don't get to criticize me or decide how I live my life. And so I don't take people personally. I pursue peace and I walk in peace. And if you bring drama to my life, I just dismiss you. Because I don't need you. Because I'm like, I don't need you. So you can go and I will be fine. And so just personally, I'm unoffensible and I try to keep myself, and I don't even know if that's a word, unoffensible.
It is now.
It is
Yes,
now. It's fine.
but so I don't take people personally, and I have a gift I think of helps. So I like to help, and that's just a large part of who I am. So it makes this feeling of I don't belong, I'm not enough, I shouldn't be here. It helps me use, I guess it's like an vantage point that I know, like I said earlier, I am enough, I do belong, I'm not afraid to be wrong, I don't have to be right, and I'm willing to learn.
It's worth considering if you've all got into this room, and many of us have publicly stated our feelings of this imposter feelings and phenomenon, it hasn't been demonstrated that the imposter phenomenon gets in the way of achievement. And so why bother talk about it if it's clearly not impacting us in getting to where we are and to where we're moving? And it is important because what has been demonstrated is that the imposter phenomenon gets in the way of how far you could actually go, because individuals tend to hold themselves back in that place, and it impacts the sense of fulfillment that you get. And so it keeps you from self-actualizing, and that is why I believe that it's such an important conversation for us to have. So the process that I've gone through, again, starting with awareness, is having that component of when I walk into a room, I will often look down at my feet and remind myself, oh, I'm in this room. So it means something. I don't need to battle with myself and struggle with, do I belong? Should I be here? Why am I here? It's, I'm in this room. And so it has taken years of that work to realize and have that strategy, but as simple as just reminding myself, oh, you can be comfortable being where your feet are because that's where you are.
I like that.
I think it's a valuable conversation in that context too, because even if you're not the one that's feeling the imposter syndrome at that point in time, there's somebody sitting next to you who is. And that's something that I think we don't really think about, because we're like, oh, I'm good, I belong here. But the person sitting next to you, even in class, like, I'm generally pretty comfortable in my classes now, because I've been able to form relationships within my department with other scholars. We can have these conversations and understand that everybody feels this. My own advisor is pretty famous people seek him out at conferences. He says to me the other day, he's like, "Oh, dude, I don't know if I was teaching that right." I'm like, "You're like famous and you still feel like you maybe didn't hit the mark on something." So I think that's important to understand, is that everybody at some point feels like they're not hitting the mark, they're not fitting in. But if we can kind of give each other a little bit of grace and say, "Hey, I'm a little uncomfortable," and just make each other feel welcome, ask questions. I mean, the greatest thing you can do for anybody is just listen to ideas,
And it's not something that comes natural to at least the populations that I've worked with, Marines, professional athletes, executives, to have this thing called self-compassion. And so it makes me sweat just saying that out loud, because I'm still working through my own self-compassion. And yet it is such an important component of actualizing, of being whole, of being present.
There's also something, I think, deliciously counterintuitive about these feelings of not belonging, because in the very moment that you feel like you must be a mistake, you are at that moment putting your self-assessment above the assessment of the people who chose you to be there, which is quite self-important in a way. It's an odd vanity to suggest that your assessment of your fitness to be in the room should supersede the fitness of the people you're feeling like an imposter in front of, which I think is wonderful. The other thing I'll say really quickly before we open to questions is I also just want to pause briefly on the power of the word "yet," because I think there is a dangerous slide here that we then suddenly, if we get our grip on imposter phenomenon, because we belong in some environments, we belong in all environments immediately. No. In fact, you can be underqualified. In fact, there can be conversations that maybe aren't appropriate for you to be a part of. But what I find is that in most cases in my own life, when I felt coming from a dairy goat farm in Central Florida to Columbia University, and my very first class, having people argue with the professor about the particular Greek translation we were using, and I didn't even know the book was in translation. I said to my professor, I don't belong here, and he just said, "Yet. You don't belong here yet." And I took it as a fucking challenge. To me, I was like, all right, that word gave me an intellectual out that really, really helped me. That maybe today I don't feel like I'm where I need to be, but I'm being told that that's a place I can get to. I don't know if that resonates.
Oh, it does.
Yeah.
I use that with my undergrads all the time.
It just denotes this idea of you never actually arrive.
That's right.
Right? It is a pursuit it's a journey that we're all on. You never get there.
Yeah.
We're all progressing.
We're good at metaphors up here, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to, those are good. I'm going to go ahead and Michelle, I'm going to open the questions. So I've got my phone, and we've got this thing. And you've got your app. So if there are questions that you have for particular members of this panel, or burning questions that you're thinking, and because you're so riddled with imposter phenomenon that you don't want to ask them aloud, we've now given you a venue to ask. And I'm going to go ahead and stand and look as they come in here.
I can't see them.
So that's great. So the first question that comes in is a gold mine.
Nice.
So we've talked about how some of this language really locates the imposter feelings in the individual. And so somehow if you're not managing it, it's a fault of your own that needs to be mitigated or managed. What it elides is this idea that our environments aren't part of this process. So for those of you who are all in your professional worlds, what do you do, the question asks, what do you do to make your environments more inclusive, to help prevent a certain amount of this or mitigate it in the people that you're working with, whether it's your office environments, your organizations, or your teams? Are there things you guys are doing?
The aspect that Chrissy mentioned, we like to talk a lot about networks, and it's something that I've kind of stricken from my vocabulary, because networks are really, they're cold, they're not useful. I don't need another LinkedIn profile or business card. I'm seeking relationships. And so the connection through relationships is how you mitigate this. So in the spaces in which I operate, it's all about how you develop deep, as Hunter said, not superficial, but deep, meaningful relationships.
And I often find that in my work environment, I try to encourage an atmosphere of community. Like I often, when I have an opinion, I make sure to preface it with a statement with, in my opinion. For example, I own a consulting company on the side, and I consult people for money, but I also consult people that I work with. And people will invite me to be on different teams because I do quality improvement and some performance type things. And so whenever I go into an environment where I'm not the lead, I also know how to follow, and I learned that in the service. And so when I find myself in a role where I am following and not leading, I'm very careful with how I approach a situation and often say, in my opinion, or have we considered that? Because in that role, I am also learning and contributing and not making my fellow coworkers feel like that imposter type of person, because that is a very, it's a hard role to find yourself in where you always feel like the underdog. You know, I served in the military for 11 years, and I was telling Chrissy earlier, I don't think I ever went to an assignment where someone was happy to see me. So when I walked in the door, it was like, this is the officer we're getting. We get you know, a black female. Nobody expected me to write, to be able to brief, to produce. And usually I had to prove myself over and over and over again. And so I got to a point where I almost became very hardened about my capabilities and my abilities. And so usually it takes about 4 to 6 months for someone to work with you to realize that you are enough. And so once I got into a role, I couldn't get out of a job. Like, no, you can't leave this unit. You'll go to this job. You'll go to that job. But when you're always proving oneself, you truly have to learn how to approach situations differently. Because if I speak my mind and I try not to make everything in my life about my blackness, I'm an angry black woman. You know, or if I start off humble, then you can't produce. What's this? And so I had to find like that happy medium where I can learn to have conversations that were inclusive, but not for everyone else in the room, for me. So I could be included. Because otherwise, I'm on the outside trying to find my way in.
I wanted to jump to, I'm just watching these, the rapidity with which these questions are coming in tells me something meaningful about the fact that people have been thinking a lot about this. Several questions focus on this idea, and I'm going to read one, and then I'm going to make a little caveat to it. It says, as a female minority vet, but I think it could be as a female vet, as a minority vet, or just as a vet. So as a vet, many opportunities have been opened to me that would not have been opened otherwise. How do I internalize my accomplishments without that internal but, or without that internal what if? And again, I think in this particular case, since everyone in this room is a member of at least one group, and then several folks are members of other groups, everyone in here can maybe hear something in that. Because this opportunities have been made available to you because of your status, is there any way to ever feel like you've truly earned a thing? That's the question that's come in from the audience.
That's a tough one.
It's a biggie.
When I was applying for this PhD program, I was up against some stiff competition. It's harder statistically to get into a PhD program than it is to get into law school and med school combined. Our program is ranked in the country, and so just astronomical, difficult odds. And I was told to counteract that application to make sure I checked every box. So make sure that you checked disabled veteran, make sure you check male, make sure you check Hispanic, check everything to increase your odds. I was being told your worth is based on, you know, these things that make you different. And that has contributed to the difficulty of feeling like if you belong in that process. I've channeled that to work harder, to know that I've earned my path, but it's certainly not something that has been an easy process.
Mm-hmm. You know, I can caveat that when I went to college the first time, because I ended up with 5 degrees somehow in all this, I had a 4-year ROTC scholarship. It was myself, and I'll admit it to this crowd, I used to refer to my best friend to this day as Black Tasha. She and I were the 2 black females who entered into Mercer's ROTC program in 1993. It was us and about 15 white males. We were the only 2 who had a 4-year scholarship. And of that group, there was the assumption that it was the year of affirmative action. So we got our scholarship because they needed minorities in the program. And I remember one day telling the group that I was with, I had a 4.02. I did very well in high school. I was an athlete, but there was somehow this undercurrent that ours was a gift and theirs was earned. And so that too, like you said earlier, has really kind of like meshed with how I approach situations, because I have had to convince myself that I belong, and that is hard to do.
Yeah, that's one that I struggle with too, because I don't, where's Andrea? Andrea's gonna be really mad about me saying this, but I don't often identify myself as a veteran elsewhere on campus. My department knows it, the Veteran Success Center knows it, you know. It's just, it's gotten to a point where I feel that makes me look entitled in some cases, just based on some of the other attitudes I see around campus. So that's one of those things that I struggle with is do I deserve this? You know, I certainly appreciate my GI Bill. I certainly appreciate everything the foundation has done for me based on the fact that I had a different job when I was younger. But for me, it's one of those things that I struggle with. What was I, and what do I want to be? And that's really hard for me in this context, because I'm like, you know, I appreciate that I'm different, that these things are afforded to me because I did these other things, but I don't think that's the label that I want.
Sure.
You know?
Sure.
And I'll take whatever help I can get. If you're gonna give me free money because I'm a black female, bring it on.
We've only known each other a couple days, but it's just been a delight.
Right? She was the first person I met.
Where's Brian? Brian, you asked can you raise your hand, Brian? This is cool. And the question begins with, in my humble opinion, which feels perfect for this situation.
That came from Brian.
Are you all right?
In my humble opinion, Brian asks, vulnerability helps create an environment of openness, being vulnerable. But how do you find the balance about how much of yourself to expose or to give? Another way of saying that, I think, would be that many of us have found that you can actually build authority by giving authority away. But where's the balance? How much of it do you give away, whether you're in a management role, whether you're leading a team in your office, or whether you experience this during your service? What's the sweet spot of showing yourself and then keeping it reined in?
I think it's really individual.
Okay.
So anecdotally, from my current experience, I have a friend in our department who's actually a professor who, the first year I was in our department, I was like, oh my God, she's like crazy. Because there wasn't any kind of feeling of humanness. It was a very driven kind of personality. You know, you never saw the inner workings of the brain. And now 2 years later, that's someone that I know probably the best out of anyone in our department. And I can see that change even where our undergrads are starting to see kind of that human undercurrent. So I think it's very different for everyone, because we all have things in our past that we don't necessarily want to make a big deal. And we don't necessarily want all of that to be out there. But I think even just showing that you are human, like sitting on this stage and, what? Fumbling through this. I think just even showing that little bit of, I'm human too, is a huge step towards actually just connecting with other people. It's huge.
Yep.
Yeah, vulnerability is a real strength. It is a personal decision. Last year, I chose to write a failure CV to share with teams of people that I work with. And I sent it out. I listed these major failures through the military, personal life, academic life, and there have been many. And one of my team members was like, I can't believe you did that. Like, I don't see you as a failure. You need to destroy that. Like, that's really holding you back.
That's awesome.
She didn't get it, right? And then it was actually at the Shadow. She's a Tillman Scholar. At the Shadow Run this year in Philly, she came up to me. She's like, hey, I was listening to NPR the other day, and I heard someone talk about like the failure CV thing, and I get it now. Like, I get why you put it out there to the group about why it is that these failures, like being vulnerable in that way, helps make you a better leader. And so, it clicked. And so, yeah, it's not a comfortable thing to have done, and yet those failures have allowed me to sit in this chair, have the opportunities that I've had, and so I've gotten comfortable with owning that's who I am.
I need to do one of those.
And I think the only caveat I might offer, I don't know if you agree, is that I think vulnerability is empowering in precisely these ways, but I also think that we have to be a little bit careful that not everyone in every situation has the privilege to be equally vulnerable. Oftentimes we can be vulnerable from a position of leadership, from a position of authority, and from a position of safety, but we can't always do a failure CV, for example, which I've also done, which was an incredible eye-opener, but it was especially eye-opening for my students who didn't think I was that person. I don't know that it would have been as useful for my dissertation committee, right? So I think you know what I mean. I think that I would just always caution. I think we valorize vulnerability in ways that make perfect sense. But to be vulnerable is, in fact, to be vulnerable. So you also have to be a little careful, right? Because not everyone deserves the gift of your vulnerability. And so just don't get it twisted. Make sure you know who you're dealing with and where you are before you give that gift of your failures, because that's exactly what it is. It's a gift, I think. So we'll just pull up one more question here, and I did want it. It's the it came early in the session, but it is a highly rated question. It touches on a couple of the things we've already touched on, but I think it'll link to a call for action at the end of the session. Again, this question says, do you ever experience internal racism? I think we could also say internal sexism. Do any of us experience an internal ism that makes us self-conscious about our accomplishments, merit-based versus proving? Again, we've seen this a couple times, but I'd be interested. We know it comes from the environment. Do any of you guys deal with this from inside, from these sort of isms that are not projected onto you by the outside world necessarily, but that you're actually replicating in yourselves, or have you sort of shed those?
I think I've shed mine. I
think so too.
I used to, but I am 44, and so I think I used to take all this personally. I think now I just don't give a darn. I mean, I care. I stand my sacred ground. I try to keep a humble nature about myself and to pursue peace and walk in peace. But at this point in my life, I just don't care. I mean, so if someone sees me as something different, that's their problem, not mine. Mm-hmm. And if the color of my skin makes someone want to, discount me, then it's their failure, not mine. Because once I have found that people see what I can and do bring to the table, that I am an accountable member of the team. And so if all their isms want to discount me, it's their loss. That sounds so conceited, but I'm cool with that.
Professional baseball historically has disenfranchised Latino ball players, despite making up this huge proportion of the sport. And so part of what my role is they've never had someone with my skill set as part of the organization. There are very few Spanish-speaking psychologists in all of pro sports. And so recognizing that there is a viewpoint of the dumb Dominican player is something that you'll hear coaches kind of talk about. And so I've had to kind of channel and recognize that for a lot of these coaches that I'm going to be working with, who I obviously have achieved a much higher level of educational success than they ever will, recognizing how that impacts the relationships that I have with coaches, with players, with the organization, is something that I've been reflecting on recently.
It's huge, huge.
Forestry is kind of an old white dude land. So, still. So, yeah, I this one, especially with this internal sexism thing, I am very aware that that is not how my advisor rolls. I came in with a project. My advisor was like, I don't really care who you are. Great idea. Let's do this thing. You're great. Let's do it. But I also sometimes wonder about the university.
Yeah.
I'm a really old ass female veteran. So how does the university look at me? So that I think that especially in forestry, because we are one of the more, we bring in a lot of money to the university. So I kind of always wonder if we're on that tipping point of didn't she? She's not an old white dude, so are we doing this whole like bring more women in thing? So yeah, I kind of wonder about that from the higher level, but having the relationships I do have within our department, I know that's not the case in our department. But yeah, it's definitely one of those things that's always kind of back there. I'm also that asshole that just like trolls the old dudes, so I'm like.
You know what's funny is I listening to you guys too. I was thinking about, I never told you guys my karaoke song. It's Jill Scott, Hate on Me.
Of course.
You know, yeah, no, it's so fitting.
And on that note, our calls to action, just really quickly, I think they're trifold. One is, I think, trying to think about how to reframe this or recalibrate this within our own minds. So one thing I might offer is when that voice in your head starts talking in ways that are counterproductive, rather than turn away from that voice, turn into that voice and have a conversation with that voice. Two, to go back to something that was said earlier, the person, you may not be managing this or thinking about it, but the person to your left or your right, or the person across the table from you, or the person on your two may be. So to have a vocabulary around this topic is, I think, useful. And then three, really for all of us to go out and to create spaces where the folks on our teams, the folks who are working for us, with us, and even above us, that we're mindful of these things and try to create inclusive and productive environments across the board. I think that's really the way forward. But I'm so thankful again to the foundation, to these incredible people who I've had the opportunity to meet, to all of you. Thank you so much. It's been really wonderful. Thanks for the opportunity.